This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 292. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is The Real Cost of Technology Dependence, Building Independence with Open Source Storage.
Yeah, in this article we talk about the value of using open source to build your infrastructure to ensure you're not beholden to various vendors, and just what problems you can run into if you don't follow those steps.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. US bans any new consumer-grade routers not made in America.
This one is really absolutely bonkers when it comes right down to it. And the made in America part is a little bit more directly applicable than it really ought to be for this to make any sense. The regulation isn't saying that only American companies can produce routers for American citizens. They're just saying the physical manufacture needs to happen in the United States. And personally, I suspect this is essentially a cash grab, because at the bottom of that executive order is some rather vague text about a special extension program that vendors can, enroll in to get a greater amount of time to come in compliance with the regulation, which just sounds like the extended hand waiting for backsheesh to me.
Yeah, I think the quote here is, there is an exemption for products that the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security have granted conditional approval for after finding these devices do not pose such unacceptable risks. And router makers may apply to the FCC to get on the approved list.
And again, all of this is just pants on the head dumb when you realize that you'd be fully in compliance with the order if all of your software is developed in an enemy of the United States, but the hardware is manufactured in the US and the firmware is flashed to it in the US. Then, hey, you're good to go. No extra scrutiny required according to this order.
Yeah. The Register looked at it, and the only routers that claim that are Starlink routers are assembled in Texas.
Yeah.
Out of chips probably made somewhere else.
And of course, if you want to personally be in compliance with this order, which isn't really an issue for the users of routers, it's about manufacturers. But if for whatever reason you found yourself unable to find an appropriate router to purchase, keep in mind OpenSense is a great answer for routing all the way up into the enterprise and can be installed on any x86 box, whether it was manufactured in America or not.
Yeah, and there's definitely the element of hypocrisy happening in this. If you recall back, would be 15 or more years ago, probably, when it was discovered that the US government was waylaying shipments of Cisco routers to other countries and mangling the firmware before it left.
The other thing that really bothers me about this is this order goes to great lengths to paint routers as these unusually vulnerable devices that, if you just get hold of the router, then you own the entire stack. And that's just not even vaguely true. We went through all these arguments when mesh Wi-Fi first became a big thing, and almost all the mesh Wi-Fi kits had severe cloud dependencies, and people got very paranoid about that. And they were paranoid specifically about the fact they were routers, which means all of your internet destined traffic goes in that router. It goes through it, whether from the inside out or the outside in. And if you don't really understand much of how modern information transfer works, that does make it sound like it's an extremely easy way to just get a handle on all of the traffic. But in reality, routers are not that valuable these days as targets. Almost all of the data that goes through that router is going to be encrypted end-to-end HTTPS, and at the router level, you can't see what's in there. All you can really see is the inside IP address, the external IP address, and the amount of traffic moving back and forth. And even that can be munged in, a more secure application that literally just throws some chaff down the wire so that you don't know exactly how much real data was transmitted and when. The most valuable thing I think that you would get out of compromising a router specifically is you would almost certainly get the ability to snoop on all of the DNS queries. And that's valuable. But the real answer here is, when you want to compile a dossier on somebody, when you want to figure out where they're going and what they're doing, These days, you're not usually even trying to look for the content of the traffic. You want to know the traffic patterns. You want to know which IP address they're talking to and when and for how long. And you just don't need a router for that. Matter of fact, the best way to get information on that is just to pay for it, because almost every website that a normal user is going to go to, over the course of their day is already bugged to hell and back for, from everybody from Amazon to, Meta, aka Facebook, to you name it. And you can get access to that data, and those tracking cookies and all the spying nonsense in the internet sites and applications that we're already using. Now that gives you a wealth of data that you cannot get just from compromising a router.
Yeah, and even with the router nowadays, a lot of browsers try to default to DNS over HTTPS and so on. And so sometimes even the DNS traffic is encrypted as well.
But if you had control over someone's router, couldn't you hijack the DNS though?
Possibly, but a router it's not the only way to do that. It's probably not the best way to do that. If you really want to compromise people's DNS at scale, for one thing, that's very noisy and you're going to get caught quick. And given that, you probably wouldn't want to do that using compromised routers, even if you had that ability. It's probably going to be better to do something like a malware campaign if you really want to hijack a ton of people's DNS overnight. It'll spread farther, it's easier to establish, and it's nowhere near as expensive. If you do something like that with routers that you've compromised, you burned it. That's going to be gone next week, pretty much.
What about if it was one individual target, though?
Again, if it's one individual target, what's so special about the router? You can set up a watering hole attack. You can target personalized ads pretty reliably to an individual person that you know much about on social media, for example. Like Facebook, there have been several stories about people who bought advertising campaigns hyper-targeted so closely that only one person saw those ads. Well, that's a great vector, again, for deploying anything from malware to just tricking somebody to doing something silly to you name it. Why you would want to use something as big and expensive and hard to set up as, an entire class of compromised router devices, because we're not talking about just compromising that person's router. We're talking about like an entire make and model of routers being compromised in the conditions they come into the country. And again, that's an expensive and difficult thing to do. It's noisy in general at all. And if you're using it for something like DNS hijacks, it's incredibly noisy. There's just better ways to do it.
And in particular, with HTTPS being almost everywhere now, it's not very effective, right? Like I can point you to not the real google.com with the bad DNS server, but your browser is going to be like, hey, this isn't the real Google, don't go here, rather than you go into the wrong site.
So essentially, this is just a bunch of nonsense, really. And it sounds to me like someone might be angling for a, what would it be, Network Administrator's Peace Prize?
Yeah, I think this is just a bog standard Trump cash grab is what it comes down to. We try really hard to stay out of politics as much as we can, but at the same time, the emperor's new clothes aren't there. He's fat and naked, folks.
What a lovely image.
I believe the Scottish made a statue of that image, actually.
We've been talking about the problem with the quality of firmware and just software in general on these routers and just how bad the security is for a long time. And while we've pushed for something to be done about it, I think the right answer is more of the stuff we talked about a couple of years ago of having something like food labeling on the router saying, we promise to support it for this long and it actually going to get security updates and be properly taken care of. Makes a lot more sense than whatever this is, because it doesn't seem to set out any way to solve the problem other than we're going to make a list and only people we like are going to be on the list.
Well, not to mention this focus on where devices are manufactured is just ridiculous, because the real vulnerability to compromise doesn't lie within the hardware. It lies within the software running on it. If this was really, truly an attempt to improve national security by way of making routers more secure, we wouldn't be focusing on where the devices are manufactured. We'd be doing something like requiring source code audits for routers that were going to be allowed in the country targeted to U.S. consumers. Say, hey, if you want to sell to, our consumers, then you're going to have to allow us to do source code audits of your firmware. Now, would manufacturers be happy about that? I can't imagine they would. Would they be willing to do it for access to the U.S. market? A lot of them probably would. A lot of them probably would not. You might even just wind up with like two branches of firmware approved for, export to the US and firmware not approved in the US. Regardless, you would at least be doing something that might actually tangibly provide some benefit. But just saying you have to build it in the US, that does nothing for security.
It wouldn't have to be open source though, right? It could just be released to certain government officials or contractors.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It wouldn't have to be open source. I'm just saying, if it's not open source, then you would have to release your source code to the FCC or, whoever the hell to audit it. And then, it would be on them to actually audit that code and look for real problems. Now, politically, there's one real big problem, with this idea. Well, there are a couple. One, again, being that's going to piss off the router vendors probably more than this rigmarole does, because it would involve more of a real operational and trade secret risk than just this nonsense with, move some manufacturing or, pay us some extra money to get away with not moving your manufacturing. But the other political problem with it is that now when you do wind up with compromised router firmware, now you have to explain why your governmental agency didn't figure that out when it had access to the source code.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. If you're evaluating endpoint management solutions, the real risk isn't which tool you choose, it's choosing one without a proven blueprint for success. Because while most endpoint tools promise automation, next to none promise outcomes. That's why Automox introduced Turnkey results. Turnkey removes the uncertainty that holds endpoint automation back. It delivers a personalized results blueprint, so Automox is configured and operated to achieve real outcomes from day one. No trial and error, just clarity. Each blueprint is validated across millions of endpoints managed by Automox and tailored to your specific environment, your risk tolerance, and your operational goals. Instead of guessing how aggressive to be with automation or how to configure policies safely, start with a plan you can trust. And you can choose to implement the plan yourself or have Automox do it for you. Either way, you get faster time to value, lower risk, and predictable endpoint outcomes. Automox Turnkey results. Know the plan, trust the result. Learn more at www.automox.com. 1,000+ cloud environments infected following Trivy supply chain attack.
If you're not familiar, Trivy is a vulnerability scanner. It's frequently integrated directly into CI/CD pipelines so that with every push into your repository, you can automatically scan to see if that push introduced any new vulnerabilities. Now, unfortunately, this makes Trivy one hell of a valuable target for an attacker to compromise itself. Because since Trivy is integrated directly into CI/CD repos, that means if you can compromise Trivy, which these attackers did, you're now going to get your malware injected directly into any number of software repositories. Because again, Trivy is allowed to touch those things. It's supposed to be looking for vulnerabilities. That also means that you're going to be getting an unusually high value cloud of targets making themselves available to you, because you're not just getting access to a whole bunch of software repos, you're specifically getting access to a whole bunch of software repos that were concerned enough about vulnerabilities to integrate automated CI/CD vulnerability scanning.
Yeah, and then once they were compromised, when they tried to refresh their credentials, they didn't get them all. And because the rotation was incomplete, the attackers were able to take control of their GitHub account and distribute more vulnerabilities. And then a couple days later, the group managed to compromise their Docker Hub account and publish 2 more malicious updates for the scanner, and then getting back into the GitHub and defacing 44 of their internal repositories and making quite a big mess.
It really does kind of highlight the etymology of getting owned in an IT sense. Like, this was not a one-off compromise. This attacker group owned the folks putting out Trivy, to the point that, like Alan was saying, even when the Trivy folks tried to kick the attackers out, they failed badly.
Aqua Security, they're called, and this does not look good for them, does it?
One might even say Aqua Security is leaking like a sieve. The other interesting thing is that very recently, a new malware payload started getting deployed by these compromised Trivy scanners. And this payload, unlike the earlier ones that seemed purely commercial, appears to be very politically targeted. It's mostly interested in systems that run Kubernetes, unless those systems also happen to be Iranian. If you're not in Iran and your system is not running Kubernetes, this particular malware payload just exits. It's not interested in you. If you are in Iran and you're not running Kubernetes, it immediately wipes your system. If you're in Iran and running Kubernetes, it not only wipes that system, it runs a daemon that attempts to wipe every single node in the entire Kubernetes cluster. Finally, for non-Iranian users that are running Kubernetes, the malware will inject a standard commercial exploit payload. So the interesting question here is this attacker group directly politically motivated? Which honestly seems pretty possible to me, because this exploit group has largely been identified as being United States and Europe based, and it's unusually thorough and sophisticated to the point that it really begins looking a lot like a nation state adversary. And so the question then becomes, well, is this actually a nation state adversary, which has also been doing simple commercial exploitation like a lot of the Russian, advanced persistent threats do? Or is this a case of, maybe US or let's be honest here, Israeli groups literally just doing business with commercial exploit groups?
That was what I thought. Are they just contractors maybe?
That's possible, but honestly, if I had to bet, I would be betting on direct Israeli action personally. This just, it has that feel to me. It's extremely sophisticated. It's extremely bold. And, well, it's attacking people that Israel really doesn't like. I mean, right now, who really hates Iran in the world? It's mostly the US or Israel. And this seems like more of an Israeli style attack to me.
Yeah, but at the same time, we've seen maybe more in the classic hacker group style that targeting specific countries is not that abnormal, like doing it for the publicity, basically, and kind of trend jacking is definitely a thing that we've seen in the past. Usually more in the anti-American sentiment, where it'd be, a hacker group from another country specifically targeting American users or whatever, but it could just be for the lulz and the publicity rather than necessarily being a state actor. Not that I'm saying it's not a state actor.
I don't know. Mostly when I've seen typically commercial exploit gangs doing obviously like geo-targeted or politically targeted attacks, I think I've mostly seen that coming out of Russia, and it gets pretty complicated when you're talking about these attacks coming out of Russia, because the Russian government absolutely directly pays Russian exploit gangs to do stuff for it, to the point where it gets kind of fuzzy when you talk about, well, what did the Russian government itself do versus what did it contract? Like, what percentage of these APTs' income comes from the Russian government versus their own scams? It all gets really hard to say. And at some point, you kind of just have to say, well, a dog is a dog is a dog. And at this point, I'm not real concerned what the breed is.
And we've talked about before how with wars these days, the kinetic aspect of it, the bombs and stuff, is only one aspect. You get the cyber aspect, which runs in parallel with it.
And this would not be the first time that Iran had very specifically been targeted by the West with cyber attacks. Mm-hmm. To the older heads around here that cared all about InfoSec, I should be able to remind you in a single word: Stuxnet.
Yep.
Something that might be telling about capabilities is that, when we saw the US do its targeted invasion of Venezuela, they were able to use cyber warfare and disable the power grid in the area they wanted to be in for a short amount of time. But with Iran, they've not done something like that and only threatened to kinetically attack the power infrastructure, not be able to just disable it with cyber attack.
I suspect Iran did a whole lot of hardening after Stuxnet. I would not be at all surprised if their power grid was considerably more protected against cyber attack than our own is.
Right. They're like, well, why don't we just air gap this? Because we'd rather have the power go out than somebody be able to turn the power out.
Kinetic bombing becomes your only real option at that point to take out the power grid, because they actually got serious about security. And that's kind of the mirror image of the US's own approach to securing its power grid from outside enemies, which is basically just like, well, yeah, we left our crap incredibly insecure and you can probably get in and, do a lot of damage, but we'll come bomb your ass if we catch you at it.
Yeah. And it's like, our reply will be kinetic.
Yeah. Whereas the whole reason that we keep messing with Iran is we don't want Iran to have kinetic options, on a scale that really bothers us.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Alex writes, the primary NAS in my home lab is a Debian box with a 5-wide RAID Z2 of 26 terabyte drives. I keep almost all my data on this NAS. About 2/3 of this data is write once, read many. The other third is more actively read and written to. I keep my applications on other servers, mostly Fedora VMs running beneath Proxmox. Each VM gets an NFS v4 mount from the NAS. Although ZFS is at the bottom of the stack, the VMs themselves largely run XFS. Am I running any significant risk of data corruption, either because of the XFS inside the VMs or the NFS on the way to their data? Should I be looking at migrating my VMs to run ZFS directly? I'm not really sure of the benefits and trade-offs in this scenario, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So in this case, since you're using Proxmox and that's ZFS underneath anyway, I think you're pretty much okay. Whatever file system's running inside the VM, whether it's Fedora with XFS or you're running a Windows with NTFS or whatever, ZFS underneath is always going to make sure that even if the whole hypervisor gets unceremoniously unplugged, it's going to have consistency from the ZFS. And then the VM, whatever file system it is running, like XFS or NTFS or whatever, when it does an fsync and says, hey, make sure this is persisted really to the disk, ZFS is going to respect that and you're going to get a consistent version. So there's not really any significant risk of data corruption there because ZFS is already going to protect you. And then the NFS is kind of the same thing. As you're going over the network, if your writing in the network goes away, that write's not going to get there. But if it was async, there was no promises anyway. And so the application expects that. And, if you're copying a file and you're partway through and it dies, it doesn't matter if it was, 60 or 65%, you're going to pick up where you left off. But if you do an fsync, where if the application says, all right, I've written this data to NFS and tell me it's definitely made it to the NAS, you'll either get a yes or no answer, or you'll get a yes once it is, or just a delay until it is, means it'll be entirely safe. If you have concerns, the answer is ZFS snapshots, right? If you're snapshotting the VM that running XFS, even if the XFS somehow gets corrupted, you have a snapshot from 10 minutes ago that is not corrupted.
Yeah, very much so. There's really no concern whatsoever to having any modern conventional file system running inside the VM when there's, when ZFS is the backing data underneath the whole shebang. Now, you will note I did say modern. You wouldn't really want to run, for example, ext2 or, like old school FAT32 as a production file system, even beneath ZFS. And the reason for that is because they're not crash safe. So every snapshot you take is the file system equivalent of just yanking the power cord out of the back of the computer for those internal file systems running beneath ZFS. ZFS itself does not care. However, if you've got a non-journaling file system and you catch it in the middle of a write, you might leave that file system corrupt, even though the ZFS part is all completely consistent. Again, in practice, this is not really a big issue. Almost anything you could even try to do is going to have a crash-consistent file system, whether that's ext4, XFS, NTFS, any of the modern Apple nonsense. They are all journaling and crash-consistent, so you don't have a problem. With NFS, your largest potential issue would be, in-flight over-the-air corruption, like over the network itself. Again, that's not a huge issue. Now, there's nothing ZFS can do about it if your data gets corrupt in flight over the network. But although you don't have the robust checksumming that ZFS offers, you do have CRC, I believe it's CRC32 checksumming on essentially any network connection, Ethernet. And that will be sufficient to catch the vast majority of all errors. I pretty famously don't think that checksumming is enough at the hardware level on drives. It used to be a thing people would say, ZFS is wasting our time with all these checksums because the hardware does checksumming already. And that's true. It does. However, with the frequency and just the sheer magnitude of individual operations that a local hard drive sees in any given day, that corruption protection is not really robust enough. But for anything you can manage to do over a LAN, I think you're going to be in very good shape.
If you are, for some reason, trying to do something with like a Windows 98, back then you remember the hypervisors would have guest utilities, a program that would run inside the VM and would coordinate with the hypervisor outside to cause the OS inside to like synchronize the disk and get it in a crash consistent state in order to take the snapshot. But good luck finding the tools for a Windows 98, and hopefully you're not having to run a Windows 98 VM still.
And honestly, even if you have to, again, the bad thing about the snapshot with a crash inconsistent file system is it's just like pulling the power cord out of the back. The good thing about it is it's no worse than pulling the power cord out of the back. And if you're old enough to recall the Windows 9X era, most of the time a power outage or somebody just hitting the power button or whatever wouldn't result in a corrupt file system. It could absolutely happen. Usually if you had like very heavy write activity going on when the cord got pulled, then you're a lot more likely to wind up with corruption. I probably should mention that's also still a possibility with some databases, and particularly database applications as well. If you really want to be completely rock solid with this, you want to make sure that all of your database engines are journaling. So that means, for example, PostgreSQL is fine, Microsoft SQL Server is fine, MySQL InnoDB is fine, MySQL MyISAM, the older protocol, is not, because it's not journaling and it's not crash consistent. And then finally, database-backed applications you want to make sure are what we call ACID compliant, which means that all your queries are wrapped in transactions to make sure that you can't get half of what should be an atomic operation completed. Because while the database itself isn't left inconsistent if that happens, the application can wind up inconsistent with the data stored in the database. So those transactions are what save you from that. But again, generally speaking, in a relatively lightly loaded small office or home lab environment, none of this is anything you have to spend a lot of skull sweat worrying about.
Yeah, ZFS is going to cover most of the bases here for you. And so just keep up with your snapshots.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.